What has almost every medieval skeleton got in common, apart from the fact that they're dead? It's their teeth. Archaeologists can categorically say that their teeth are so much better than ours and that diabetes was very rare. And the main reason for that was the lack of sugar. The knowledge of obtaining sugar from sugarcane has been around for thousands of years. However, due to where it was grown, getting hold of it in the UK was very difficult and expensive. So expensive, in fact, that sugar was reserved for the higher upper classes and for royalty. It was normal for the majority of the populace to never sample or even see sugar, except in the odd treat as honey. Unfortunately, the import of sugar started the UK on the road to addiction. It was brought over in large cones called loaves. The loaves were taken to greengrocers and the sugar was shaved off using cutters. Thanks to better transport links, sugar was more attainable, however, it was still out of reach for much of the population. One of the largest exports of sugar was Cuba. It had been growing sugar for hundreds of years, but it was Spain that used the land to grow it commercially. It was a cruel affair. The sugar plantations were grown on the backs of slaves, and the slaves' conditions were nothing short of barbaric. Beatings were normal, women were assaulted, and children were separated from loved ones. The slaves were nothing but property in the eyes of the owners, and as such could be used as seen fit. Moving sugar from the plantation to the boat was also not easy. The roads were simple mud tracks, and the roads that were built were not the best. The railroad boom would very quickly hit the country, and almost from the very beginning, plans were put in place for Cuba to have a railway. Its sugar plantations were vital to the economy, and its sugar exports made up to 80% of the total exports for the country. Although processed sugar is a stable product and travels easily by boat, the quicker the sugar could get to the dock, the quicker it could be sold. In 1836, the first horse-drawn railway was conceived, and it still relied on horse and cart, but the rails made moving the cart easier, and with it more sugar. But in the days of early steam, the lure of engines was simply too much, and the first steam engine was run from Havana to Bejul a year later. This train would be the first in Latin America. In 1839, the line was extended again. In 1843, San Felipe and Batabano were connected, further extensions planned. Moving into cities started a switch in the railway movement. The movement of sugar would still be a primary, however passenger movements would be important as well. In 1859, the first streetcar in Havana was introduced, with others to follow. Like many railway infrastructures, the railway was divided and independently owned, and like other countries, rivalries were not far away. Some railways would end up, though, merging. By now, steam was everywhere. In 1898, Cuba broke from Spain and now a republic. The nearby country of the USA heavily invested in it. It wasn't just a gracious gesture. The USA relied heavily on Cuban sugar and needed Cuba back on its feet and exporting again. The investment also included railway upgrades. It worked as production exploded to over 25 million tonnes by 1925, and over 19% of the sugar would now leave the country. And by the end of the 1920s, all those railways had amalgamated into 4. In 1940, a general decision was made to make the move from steam to diesel. Despite its size, Cuba was a vital part in the Second World War, especially in working with the United States. The war had created a coal shortage, and with Cuba relying on imports to keep going, the move to diesel seemed a viable option. After the war, while other countries started to move freight to the roads, Cuba kept its freight on the tracks, and for the next 10 years, things ran smoothly. In 1958, the history of Cuba took a dramatic turn. Fidel Castro's rebel forces were gaining strength, and the forces head to the town of Santa Clara. The government forces, led by Fulgencio Batista, fought to keep order and sent to the president's own armoured train filled with weapons and ammo to keep the peace. The guards set up outside the town, however they had to retreat. The rebel forces were fierce, and the troops decided to move the train to the centre of the town. As they moved, the town erupted in skirmishes. All focus went to the train and the 300 men that protected her. A second rebel force, also knowing that the train's importance, used tractors to rip the rails up, and as the train began to flee, it hit broken track and derailed. The soldiers, faced with the rebel forces and demoralised by the regime and the defeat, turned and joined forces with the rebels, and less than 12 hours later, Cuba was in the hands of rebel hands, with Castro declared leader. One of the first orders the new government made was to nationalise the railway. The only exception would be a group called Minas, which handled the sugar. At the same time, British Rail contacted the government and offered help with a new fleet of engines. They shipped as many as they could, but were hampered by the Cuban Missile Crisis. To help fulfill orders, engines would have to be put on ships owned by other countries. The embargo, brought by the USA, also meant that Cuba was restricted in who they approached and getting new equipment. However, despite this, in recent years, other countries such as France, China and Mexico have been able to trade. But what of the sugar? The production suffered after the revolution, and the embargo meant a lot of parts used for sugar production couldn't be obtained. Cuba also lost a valuable trading partner and had to turn to the Soviets for trade. When the Soviets collapsed in 1991, Cuba's exports were decimated and has declined ever since. It barely makes over 500,000 tonnes a year, a huge drop from the 7.1 million tonnes 30 years ago. But tourism is helping. Steam engines are still working and are now moving people rather than sugar. While it's an older system, it does work rather well, and it does play a strong role in keeping the country running.